Everything you think you know about the so-called Jesus family tomb is probably shaped by a single documentary from 2007, and almost every claim made in that documentary has been argued over ever since. Now, a new round of DNA analysis, conducted with tools that didn't exist 20 years ago, is producing results that both supporters and critics are calling controversial. The findings don't prove a religious story. They don't disprove one either. But they do complicate a debate that most people assumed had been settled. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what was actually found, where, and when. In March of 1980, construction workers expanding a residential neighborhood in the Talpiot district of Jerusalem accidentally broke through the roof of an ancient rock-cut tomb. Archaeologists from the Israel Antiquities Authority arrived quickly, following standard protocol for a find of this kind. What they documented over the following days has been described by Israeli archaeologist Amos Kloner, who led the official excavation in a series of academic reports. The tomb was a typical first-century Jewish burial chamber, with shelves carved into the stone and niches for bone boxes known as ossuaries. 10 ossuaries were recovered. 6 of them bore inscriptions. Those inscriptions are the reason this tomb became famous more than 2 decades after it was excavated. According to the official catalog, the names included Yeshua, Bar Yehosef, which translates to Jesus son of Joseph, Marimi Mara, which some scholars have interpreted as a form of Mary, Yos, a short form of Joseph, Mattia, meaning Matthew, Yehuda Bar Yeshua, meaning Judah son of Jesus, and Maria, another form of Mary. A 7th ossuary, the so-called James ossuary, bearing the inscription James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, was later alleged by some researchers to have originally come from the same tomb, though this link is vigorously disputed. At face value, it is a striking cluster of names. The documentary that brought this tomb to public attention in 2007 argued, through statistical modeling, that the odds of finding this exact combination of names in one burial chamber, purely by chance, were extraordinarily low. Critics push back hard, and their objections are important. First, the names in question were among the most common Jewish names of first-century Judea: Yeshua, Yosef, Maria, Yehuda. These were not unusual. 1 out of every 10 men in the region at that time was named some form of Joseph. 1 out of every 6 women bore some form of Mary. Any random cluster of ossuaries from the period would be statistically likely to contain several of these names. Second, the statistical model used in the documentary was critiqued by professional statisticians who argued the assumptions built into it skewed the results. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the vast majority of mainstream biblical scholars and archaeologists, including Amos Kloner himself, have publicly stated they do not believe this is the tomb of the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth. That was essentially where the debate stood. A contested interpretation. A tomb with a suggestive set of names, and a scholarly consensus that the evidence was thin. What changed recently is the DNA. A small amount of biological material had been preserved on 2 of the ossuaries during the original excavation. Specifically, bone residue from the ossuary labeled Yeshua Bar Yehosef, and from the ossuary labeled Marimin Mara. The original researchers conducted a limited mitochondrial DNA test years ago and concluded that the 2 individuals were not maternally related. In other words, whoever these 2 people were, they did not share a mother, which meant they were not mother and son or brother and sister. That finding, on its own, was interesting but inconclusive. Mitochondrial DNA only traces the maternal line. 2 people unrelated through their mothers could still be husband and wife, or cousins or total strangers interred in the same family tomb for reasons we don't fully understand. What is being described as the newer analysis involves updated sequencing techniques applied to the preserved residue. Advances in ancient DNA recovery, the same field that has revolutionized our understanding of Neanderthals and ancient migration patterns, have made it possible to extract more information from very small degraded samples. The reports circulating from researchers involved in recent reanalysis efforts suggest that the updated profiles still cannot establish definitive identities for the individuals in the tomb, but they do raise possibilities that the original studies were not equipped to address. Possibilities about ancestry, about population groupings, about whether the cluster of remains looks more like a family unit or a random mix. And this is where the word controversial becomes unavoidable, because regardless of what any DNA test shows, there is a fundamental limit to what this kind of analysis can prove about a tomb like this. Ancient DNA, even when recovered cleanly, cannot identify a specific historical person by name. It cannot match a bone fragment to a figure known only from texts. It can, at best, tell us about biological relationships among the people inside the tomb, their broad population origins, and in some cases their sex. It cannot resolve questions about faith, history, or theology. That hasn't stopped the results from being interpreted in dramatically different ways. On one side, researchers who have long argued that the Taupiat tomb deserves more serious attention see the updated data as consistent with their hypothesis. They argue the biological relationships, or lack thereof, among the individuals in the tomb match a plausible reading of the New Testament family tree. They continue to publish, respond to critics, and push for the tomb to be reopened for fuller analysis. That access has largely not been granted, in part because of religious and ethical concerns around disturbing a burial site in Jerusalem. On the other side, mainstream biblical archaeologists and historians continue to push back. Their position, articulated by researchers including Jody McNiss of the University of North Carolina and Eric Myers of Duke, is that the entire framing of the Taupiat tomb as the burial site of Jesus of Nazareth and his family rests on assumptions that don't hold up under scrutiny. They note that a family from Nazareth would most likely have been buried in Nazareth, not Jerusalem. They point out that the historical Jesus family was, by every textual indication, poor, and the Taupiat tomb, while modest, reflects a degree of economic stability that doesn't quite match. And they argue that none of the new DNA results change these underlying concerns. There is also the broader question, raised by scholars of early Christianity, about what a physical burial would mean for the textual tradition. The resurrection narrative is central to Christian theology. A tomb with remains, by definition, is at tension with that narrative. Some researchers have argued that framing the DNA story in terms of religious implications is itself a kind of overreach, because the physical evidence, whatever it says, operates on a completely different level from theological claims. So when you ask what the results actually show, the honest answer has several layers. The biological analysis is genuinely interesting. Recovering any usable DNA from 2,000-year-old ossuaries is a technical achievement in itself. The relationships indicated by the data are consistent with the tomb being used by a family unit that included members who were not all maternally related, which is exactly what you would expect from a first-century Jewish family tomb, where wives, children, and in-laws might share space across generations. The interpretation of those relationships in light of the inscriptions is where the controversy lives. There is no DNA test that can confirm whether Yeshua bar Yehoseph, the Jesus son of Joseph of this particular ossuary, was the historical Jesus of Nazareth, or one of the thousands of other men named Jesus, son of Joseph, who lived in the region during the same era. The DNA can narrow some possibilities. It cannot close the question. And the question of whether the results support a religious or historical claim is, in the end, a matter of framing rather than science. A skeptic looking at the data sees a tomb with a statistically unremarkable set of common first-century names and a pattern of biological relationships that fits almost any plausible family. A proponent looking at the same data sees a convergence of details that, in their view, is too suggestive to ignore. Both can be argued in good faith. That's part of what makes the debate so persistent. There's also a quieter, less sensational version of this story that tends to get lost in the controversy. Regardless of whose tomb Taupiat actually was, the site offers real value as a window into first-century Jewish burial practices, into the naming conventions of the period, and into how archaeological interpretation intersects with modern technology. Each time a new technique is developed, whether it's improved radiocarbon dating, better isotope analysis, or more sensitive DNA sequencing, old finds can be re-examined, with questions that simply weren't available when they were first discovered. The Taupiat tomb happens to be one of the more emotionally charged examples of that process. But it is not the only one, and the methodology applied there is being used on sites all over the world. It's also worth sitting with the broader question of what we actually want from this kind of evidence. For many believers, the physical identification of a tomb associated with Jesus of Nazareth would not change and is not supposed to change the core of their faith. Faith, by its nature, is not contingent on empirical confirmation. For historians, the identification would be a significant, but circumscribed, result. It would tell us something about where a particular family lived and how they were buried, but it would not resolve the larger, historical questions about how the figure of Jesus is to be understood in the context of first-century Judea and the Roman Empire. For scientists, the DNA is interesting exactly to the extent that it teaches us about ancient populations and techniques. It is less interesting, honestly, when framed as a theological verdict. None of these perspectives are wrong. They are asking different questions. What the new round of analysis seems to be doing, whether by intention or not, is forcing a conversation about the limits of what scientific evidence can and cannot say about contested historical claims. The tomb at Talpiot has become a kind of case study for that conversation. And every time a new report emerges, the same debate plays out, with roughly the same lineup on each side, and roughly the same level of unresolved ambiguity. Future work may close some of the gaps. If researchers are ever granted access to perform more comprehensive testing on all of the ossuaries rather than just a few, the picture might sharpen. If improved techniques allow for better dating and better population inference, the tomb's position within the mosaic of first-century Jerusalem burial sites may become clearer. And if, as some researchers have argued, the James ossuary can be definitively connected or disconnected from the Talpiot chamber, that alone would change the statistical analysis significantly. Until then, the most honest description of the current state of the evidence is this. A tomb was found in Jerusalem in 1980. It contained a collection of common first-century names, one of which happens to match, in general form, a central figure of Christian tradition. DNA analysis confirms that the individuals inside were not all maternally related, which is compatible with many possible family structures. Updated analysis is producing data that both supporters and critics of the tomb's famous interpretation are using to argue their case. And the interpretation itself, whether this is a historically significant tomb or a statistically unremarkable one, continues to depend on assumptions that reasonable people can and do disagree about. The results are controversial, as the headlines say. But the controversy is less about the DNA than about what we want the DNA to mean. That distinction is easy to lose. It's also arguably the most important part of the story. It's worth spending a moment on the broader history of how ancient DNA has been used in biblical archaeology, because the Talpiot tomb sits within a larger methodological conversation. Over the last decade, researchers have applied similar techniques to skeletons recovered from first-century sites across Israel and Palestine. They have extracted DNA from the bones of individuals buried in the Jerusalem area, from the ancient inhabitants of towns like Ashkelon, from the remains of people who lived through the Roman period in Judea. The collective picture that has emerged is one of a genetically diverse, deeply interconnected regional population, with ancestry patterns that reflect centuries of movement, trade, and occasional conflict. That context matters because it places whatever was found at Talpiot within a framework of realistic expectation. The individuals inside the tomb, whoever they were, would have been part of that broader population. Their DNA profiles would reflect that inheritance. Any pattern identified in the Talpiot samples has to be compared against the range of profiles that are normal for the period, rather than interpreted in isolation. This is the kind of careful comparative work that is still ongoing. It does not produce headlines. It does produce a slowly improving baseline against which new finds can be measured. There is also an ethical dimension to this story that deserves acknowledgement. The individuals whose remains are inside the Talpiot ossuaries were real people. They lived, they had families. They were buried with care, in accordance with the customs of their community. The ethical frameworks that govern archaeological research increasingly recognize that human remains are not simply data points. They are the physical traces of people whose descendants, in some cases, still live in the region. Any analysis of those remains carries with it an obligation to proceed with respect, to minimize unnecessary handling, and to consider the wishes of descendant communities where applicable. Part of the reason that further testing at Talpiot has been limited is that these considerations are taken seriously by the Israel Antiquities Authority and by the research community more broadly. Some critics of the original 2007 documentary raised concerns along exactly these lines, arguing that a media-driven narrative risked treating the tomb as a spectacle rather than as the burial site it remains. Those concerns are worth sitting with. Even setting aside the religious sensitivities, there is a question about what it means to subject a set of ancient remains to sustained public scrutiny, to speculate publicly about their identities, and to produce programming about them for mass audiences. There is no single right answer to that question. Reasonable people can hold different views about the balance between scholarly access and respectful restraint. For now, the tomb remains sealed. The debate remains open. And the tools we use to peer into the past keep getting sharper, one small fragment at a time. If there is something to take from all of this, it may be less about the specific identities of the individuals inside the tomb and more about how we engage with evidence that doesn't resolve cleanly. Most real historical questions end up looking something like this. Partial records. Ambiguous artifacts. Tools that illuminate some aspects while leaving others in shadow. Reasonable interpretations that disagree. A slow accumulation of small facts that, over time, either converge on a picture or reveal that the picture is more complex than we thought. The Talpiot tomb is a particularly dramatic example. But the pattern it illustrates is common across every era of history that we try to reconstruct from physical remains. Our instruments get better. Our questions get sharper. The answers often get more rather than less interesting. Whether the individuals inside were the family of a historically significant figure, or a first-century Jerusalem family of more ordinary standing whose names happen to overlap with a later tradition, the tomb is a real window into a real community that lived 2,000 years ago. That alone is worth the care we have taken to study it. And that care is, in the end, what good archaeology is supposed to look like. Not a rush toward confirmation. A slow, considered engagement with the material, always willing to revise, always honest about what it can and cannot say. There is a further layer to this story that tends to get lost, and it concerns how the Talpiot tomb sits within the history of contested biblical archaeology more broadly. For as long as scholars have been digging in the Eastern Mediterranean, finds have been interpreted and reinterpreted through the lens of whatever religious or historical tradition was most prominent at the moment of discovery. Mount Sinai has been claimed from multiple locations. The supposed path of the Exodus has been traced through more than one desert. The original site of the crucifixion has been placed, over the centuries, in several different spots around and outside the walls of Jerusalem. Each of these contested identifications, when examined carefully, turns out to rest on a mix of textual interpretation, selective archaeological reading, and the particular assumptions of the era in which the claim was first made. This is not a criticism of the people who made the claims. It is a description of how archaeology actually works when it intersects with texts that carry enormous cultural weight. The readings of evidence are shaped by the expectations of the readers. The readers, in turn, are shaped by the traditions they inherit. Over generations, the interpretations evolve, and each successive generation looks back at the previous one with a mixture of respect and puzzlement about how certain claims could ever have seemed so solid. The Talpiot tomb is unlikely to be an exception to this pattern. 50 years from now, researchers will probably look back at the current moment, with its DNA analyses and statistical arguments and reopened debates, and see some features of the discussion as foundational, and others as curiosities of a particular era's preoccupations. That is part of the reason scholars are so careful about the language they use. The claims that survive generational scrutiny are usually the ones that were framed most modestly when they were first made. One more context that deserves mention is the role of emerging technologies beyond DNA analysis itself. Isotopic analysis of bone material can reveal where individuals grew up and how they moved during their lives. Advanced radiocarbon techniques can narrow dating ranges. High-resolution three-dimensional imaging can reveal inscriptions invisible to the naked eye. Any one of these techniques, applied carefully, could add meaningful data to the conversation. Whether a coordinated study ever takes place will depend on institutional willingness, ethical considerations, and the practical challenge of working with ancient fragile material. Most of the analyses conducted to date have been on limited samples, driven by specific researchers rather than by any long-term program. The DNA results are one more piece of evidence within that process. They are not the last word. They are unlikely to be. The next generation of techniques will almost certainly allow for readings we cannot currently produce, and those readings will themselves be refined by the generation after. The conversation will continue. It should. For now, what the public can reasonably take away is this. A tomb exists. It is real. It contains real human remains whose identities are genuinely uncertain. Modern science can tell us some things about those remains, and it cannot tell us others. The current round of DNA analysis has added data without resolving the central question. And the reason for the controversy is not the data itself, but the competing frameworks through which different people interpret it. That is the accurate picture. Anyone claiming more certainty than that, in either direction, is adding conviction to evidence that has not yet earned it. The real answer, if one ever comes, will emerge slowly. It will arrive in a peer-reviewed paper that most people will not read, with conclusions that will be hedged appropriately by careful language. And it will contribute one more piece to a puzzle that has been assembling, piece by piece, for 2,000 years. That is how real archaeology resolves real mysteries. And that is, in the end, how this one will be resolved too, if resolution turns out to be possible at all.